Now that Summer Games Fest has come and went, you may have noticed something interesting about a lot of games being shown from all the various showcases. It's a lot of games that would normally be exclusive in some way on PlayStation suddenly being on everything else now, so what's going on? Well, it's a lot. For example, Final Fantasy VII Revelation, the finale to Square Enix's remake trilogy, is no longer a PS5 console exclusive. The game is now confirmed, as Open Critic stated here, that the final game is now coming to everything day one, which is a big change since Rebirth and Remake, the previous two games, were PS5 console exclusives for at least a year before they went on to other platforms. It became normal for many games to do this as well, right? Kingdom Hearts 4, as Open Critic stated here, will also be releasing on everything as well, whereas before the Kingdom Hearts series was mostly a PlayStation console exclusive series apart from spin-offs on Nintendo consoles. This is also no longer the case. Stellar Blade Blood Rain, as confirmed by IGN here, will be self-published by Shift Up, whereas the first game in that series was also a PS5 console exclusive for at least a year until it went to PC. Now the sequel is coming everywhere. Persona 6, as Gamatsu confirmed here, is also coming to everything as well, whereas Persona 5 and the other Persona games were usually PlayStation console exclusives for at least a year. Again, this is also, no surprise, no longer the case either. Persona 4 Revival, the remake of the beloved classic and one of my favorite entries in the series, is also no longer a PlayStation console exclusive, which P4 was, and even its updated version Golden was on the PS Vita for years until it eventually came to PC way after. But the remake, nope, also no longer tied to just Sony's console, as Video Games Chronicle confirms here as well. Resident Evil Code Veronica's remake is also not a PS5 console exclusive either. And the series in general has moved away from being that on Sony's end for a very long time now too. Even Stranger Than Heaven, as confirmed here, is also not a PS5 console exclusive, despite the developer's previous games like the Yakuza franchise beginning on PlayStation all those years ago, and it's a pattern that keeps forming. Nothing third party seems to be releasing as a console exclusive on PlayStation anymore, and it's painting the picture that Sony is losing these partnerships they once used to revel in. So what's going on? Why is Sony losing their ability to be a strong enough platform like they used to be when it comes to being a compelling platform meant for publishers and studios to bank their futures on? Why is everyone leaving Sony PlayStation? The question is all encompassing. To pinpoint the exact moment that Sony turned towards their path of no longer being a brand that developers could reasonably bank on like they used to, I think it's a few things. So let's get into it. That was a long intro, my God. For one, from SiliconANGLE all the way back in 2016, as you can see here, Sony moved their PlayStation headquarters from Tokyo, Japan, all the way to California. As then President and CEO of Sony, Andrew House, put it here, by integrating the strengths of PlayStation's hardware, software, content, and network operations, Sony Interactive Entertainment will become an even stronger entity, with a clear objective to further accelerate the growth of the PlayStation business, which they did to a certain degree, but also made quite a bit of slop too. A lot of players online will tell you the same thing. It started to change slowly but surely once Sony moved to California, and I think the reasoning was obvious. Sony, I know, is a Japanese company built upon Japanese values and customs. Wow, who could have guessed it? And California is largely controlled by people who lean politically in such a way that, let's just say, they are constantly trying to push what they think are progressive values, when they are almost always destructive instead. The problem is that Sony needs its values to still be Sony. Up until maybe 2020, Sony was at least mostly keeping their identity in check following the PS5 launch. And the explosion of post-COVID era expansion, things got, well, a lot worse. Companies bulked up, hiring en masse thousands of developers into these studios that were believed to be needed. It bloated and ballooned the entire games industry to unsustainable levels. The massive expansion of the games industry in 2020, which Sony did as well as everybody else, was seen as a new golden age for video games. Jason Schreier, for example, explained in a video on his channel, as seen here, that he goes into depth on why games take so long to make, why they're expensive, and all of that. I won't show any of his footage because he'll probably copyright me, but the point being is that Jason is largely an apologist for the sorts of practices that companies like Sony have been pushing for so long and why things are not working. In Jason's opinion, it's likely the reason why Sony lost their partnerships is because games are too expensive now to make. The teams are far too large. The overhead is insane. PlayStation, and apparently this is all our faults and not Sony's or Microsoft's or any other bigwig company that, holds all the cards. It's an apologist way of simply saying, well, things are the way they are because we screwed up, but we don't want to label it that way. So instead, we're just going to pass off the problem to you. It's not my fault or yours that Sony lost their partnership deals with practically everybody. Why no single third-party company wants to sign any exclusive deals or contracts with PlayStation to make their games console exclusives or have a limited time window like they did before, like all of the time. But the answer is simple. It's because Sony has squandered their opportunities, and to frame it is as if it's our fault or that we need to now pay more for games that aren't as good doesn't make any sense to me. These publishers have had nothing but decades to make as much money as humanly possible off of each and every one of us. They've had every good grace and opportunity to make sure they meet the demands of their player bases at any given moment, yet with their policies, or shifting their entire headquarters from their home countries of all things to California of all places, and then they ignore the fact that maybe the local political state of your new HQ will maybe have, a massive effect on your games. That's kind of hubris to me. The reason why people love Sony is simple. It's because they're Japanese. It's like anime. You don't watch anime because it reflects Western values. You enjoy it because it's inherently Japanese at its core. It's something that can only exist because the nature and society that it originated from is wholly unique. The problem with Sony is that they seem to be at odds with their own nature. They're a Japanese company that believes that they need to be westernized. But by adopting values that they weren't built upon, they run the risk of losing their ability to be who they actually were in the first place. Before PlayStation meant something, when you bought a console from Sony, you knew what you were getting into. Unique first-party games and something completely different from anything else being made in the industry, like Parappa the Rapper. Look at that little guy dance. Oh, so great. But PlayStation before wasn't even trying to be like everyone else. They were instead, setting a standard. But with how they're going about things now, it feels as though Sony is drifting away from their identity, and while sure they're pouring more money than ever into these future blockbuster games, the core problem still exists, that PlayStation, as an identity, is worse for it. Those partnerships deals that are shifting, that's a red flag. And you have to wonder if Sony even knows what PlayStation stands for anymore, because from where I'm standing, Sony seems determined to trade its unique identity for something that's safer, broader, and ultimately way less memorable in the long run. And I truly believe that might be the biggest mistake the company has made in a lot of years. Well, that and, giving like $400 million to Naughty Dog to make a bald woman space game, but that's besides the point. It's as if they're systematically dismantling their Japanese DNA at their core to chase sterile, westernized game design instead. But if you ask me, that's never been what Sony was about. Many of Sony's franchises now are westernized to such a point it doesn't feel as if Sony's identity is as strong as it used to be. Is it any wonder that the single game that not only won Game of the Year when it released but made waves was Astro Bot? A game by Team Asobi, which is a studio comprised of somewhere close to only 60 Japanese developers. And Astro Bot is unapologetically a PlayStation game made by Japanese developers, and it shows because it oozes creativity. It has brand recognition up the wazoo and borderline perfect game design that excites you at every turn. I love that game. There's a reason it won all the awards that it did, because Astro Bot is Sony Japan, and it fully embraces that. Astro Bot is also not a fully priced title. Maybe they can learn from that too, nor is it made with a ballooning budget compared to Sony's other games, which again, they can learn from that as well. Whereas most Sony first-party games must sell millions upon millions of copies to achieve profitability, because Astro Bot's budget was somewhere apparently in the 20 to maybe 50 million range, give or take, it didn't need to sell nearly as much to break even. Plus, the game was made in about 2 to 3 years of dev time, which for AAA game development these days, that's almost unheard of. But that's why Astro Bot is so beloved, because it's what Sony should be about, great Japanese games, not Western, Japanese. No wonder why the games they had partnerships with before, like Final Fantasy, relished on the PlayStation ecosystem like they did, right? Because the identity of those games and Sony's identity coalesced perfectly. In Square Enix's case, the straw that broke their Chocobo partnership back exclusivity with Sony were two games in particular, Final Fantasy 16 and Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth. Both games are PS5 console exclusives, because every Final Fantasy game was to some degree exclusive for a time on Sony's hardware before. Well, I guess before PlayStation existed, it was on Nintendo, but you get the idea. But anyway, because as Sony began to walk away from their Japanese roots, specifically with the PS5, their core identity was no longer aligned with the sorts of players who would buy Rebirth or say 16, which damaged both of those games' sales. This pivot that Sony has made towards erasing their Japanese identity is nothing short of a misguided mission that is effectively erasing their history and identity in the search of easy money. Ironically, Sony would likely make even more money if they just doubled down on what people knew them for, right? Single-player games are more popular than ever. They're consistently the highest-selling games of the year almost always outside of, say, a Call of Duty title, and Sony had the pulse on what people actually wanted. But what they're doing these days isn't working. Jason Schreier can cry all he wants in his videos or articles saying, oh, it's the economy, or that these games are too expensive to be made. But think about it. Most of these Sony first-party studios are money sinkholes by design now. Studios like Bungie, for example, they exist and operate outside of places like Washington, like a highly expensive location, with insane overhead, and the salaries of their developers needs to be compensated because of where they live, right? Meaning that any content made by Bungie, for example, a Western studio owned by Sony, is going to be wildly expensive to get any sort of meaningful content out on a timely manner. Obviously, Sony Santa Monica is in California, another ludicrously expensive location to live. It's not just a location either, is it, Sony? You guys also hired far too many people believing that the money would come anyways to compensate for the bloat, but you not only hired too many people, you hired the wrong sorts of people who clearly do not align or want to make the sorts of games that would be considered not only profitable, but make sense in a brand loyalty sort of way either. You have developers out here making games where they're talking down to their users, offering them games disguised as humiliations. For example, let's look at a recent one, right? Saros from Housemarque, as IGN stated here. Saros launched to around 300,000 copies sold on PS5. Currently, as far as I can tell, that number is now somewhere around 400 to at best maybe 500,000. That is catastrophically abysmal for a Sony first-party studio game. Saros's budget was likely somewhere close to 100 million at least, I would wager. Its visuals, when you're out actually playing it, it looks good. Its gameplay is fun. The sound design is incredible. Unfortunately, like most Sony games these days, the story's not good, its characters are awful, and the overall message of the game is men are bad and evil and toxic, while women are the best, pretty much, and that's it. Gee, I wonder why your game only sold a fraction of what Returnal did. It's a shame because Saros didn't have to be this way, but the developers, again, rejecting what Sony PlayStation fans wanted, decided to make a game they wanted to see, as opposed to what fans wanted instead, right? And PlayStation was built on that risk and creativity, but at its core, it was that uncompromising duty to the Japanese quality that allowed Sony to fundamentally make something different from what anyone else was doing. Saros was almost that. It was on the cusp. It was right there, but the part that annihilated their sales and goodwill was, like always, the story and characters, which was absolutely written by Western minds and hands. There's no way otherwise. A gruff military man gets sidelined by his wife he's chasing the entire game's story, who leaves him for another woman. And even when he does find her, she still rejects him anyways and decides she'd rather be alone than ever be with him again. Great story, Housemarque. You just had to make another Sony game where the male characters suck and the female ones are always in the right. Amazing. Who could have seen that one coming? Sony's uniqueness, by the way, that was their advantage at one point. But it seems like these days Sony's core development studios want nothing to do with the fact that they're supposed to strengthen that brand. Instead, it seems like their developers are doing everything they can to tear it down instead. This then brings me to further my point, Bruce Straley. So if you don't know who this is, he used to work at Naughty Dog on Uncharted, Jak and Daxter. He also directed the first Last of Us game. This is what he said via Twitter recently. Without developers, we have no games. Without developer stability, we have no good games. I wish I heard less. We have to listen to the players. And more developers are our future, from the people strategizing our collective gaming, he continues. In my experience, when given stability, creative freedom, and access to the technology specs for a platform, developers can create wonderful experiences that exploit the hardware, that showcase the platform, and resonate with the players. He keeps going. Without stability and trust in publications and fundings and intentions, developers are incapable of creating anything out of the box or pushing the medium. It's too risky. It's risky for the developer, and it's risky for the funders and publishers, and there's no mental space to afford true creativity. He finishes with this. I just hear we have to listen to the players a lot lately, but this is going to create another reactive strategy. It's not a vision. vision, it's not leadership, it's not stability, and it's not supporting the people that actually come up with the creations that players enjoy. I should probably first say I have nothing against Bruce Straley. I think he has done good work. However, while developers are essential, I do agree, the industry exists because players voluntarily spend money on these games. So by definition, when studios like Sony First Party stop listening to what players want, which they've been doing for a while now outside of a few rare success stories, no amount of developer stability can reasonably fix a game that nobody wants to buy or play. A counterpoint to Bruce Straley, many of the biggest failures commercially and all of that of the last decade alone were actually made by studios with so-called experienced development teams, right? Games like Concord, Kill the Justice League, or Babylon's Fall. These were all made by teams that came from respectable, experienced AAA backgrounds. These projects were not created because developers lacked stability. Either they often had substantial budgets actually and very long development timelines. And again, they had talented teams behind them with plenty of experience. The problem, in my opinion, wasn't that developers weren't listened to enough. The problem was that audiences weren't listened to enough instead. Bruce Straley is correct, however, that creative freedom can make amazing games. Of course, that's true. But creative freedom can also produce products that fail commercially, and the market doesn't reward effort or passion or stability automatically or something. It instead rewards games that players actually want to play. And that's something that Bruce here, and by and large Sony as an entire platform, seems to be forgetting constantly these days. I think a big problem that Bruce doesn't realize he kind of just made, which coincides directly with Sony and why they're losing those partnership deals and market share, is that a lot of games today are made in insulated environments. So what do I mean by that? Well, an insulated environment, it's like a bubble. Only the people who are working on it can speak on the thing that's getting made. This is good in a way, but bad because glaring issues can easily be looked over because everyone in said insulated environment are high off their own toxic positivity. This is why you have games, like I said, Concord, Babylon's Fall, and more that are projects that took years to make, involving hundreds of developers. And it also proved how quickly and easily many studios, regardless of experience, can lose sight of what players are actually asking for these days. So to counter Bruce's argument, the industry doesn't suffer from listening to players too much. It actually often suffers from listening to them too little, if you ask me. And this is why Sony's loss of identity is so easily evident to everybody who doesn't work there. Because Sony and their first-party studios are like my insulated bubble analogy, but instead on a global scale. These people all work in these confined areas, huffing their own farts and positivity constantly. So when someone who isn't in that bubble looks in and calls them crazy, what do? They get offended and they think you're wrong. It's like a bunch of pigs, right? Sloshing in the mud, just being absolutely rancid and gross. And then you look at it and go, man, those pigs smell awful. What in God's name is going on in there? And the pigs go, hey, you can't be here. This is our pen. Get out of here. I mean, okay, I guess, but it doesn't change the fact that what's going on in that space is gross, stupid, and clearly has no idea what the outside world thinks of it. Like, okay, devs do need stability, creative freedom. Okay, that too. And publishers also need sustainable budgets, and players need to be heard, and demands must be met. And if any one of those four things are not being addressed, that's when your problems are going to emerge. In a way, what Bruce is saying, and you can tie this to Sony even, is that Bruce, like Sony, is overcorrecting against a trend that he, like Sony, believes by elevating developers above consumers that it suddenly makes their opinions more valid. But the cold, hard reality is with no consumers, you have no sales, revenue, studios, jobs, or a future. That can't be denied. Unless there's like, I don't know, a magical fairy multiverse dimension where they have all the money in the world. And these fairies are like people they can cater to that have like full-on Zer non-binary, like whatever fairies who will buy your games no matter what. I kind of think their plans are kind of cooked if they're not catering to the people on Earth. That's all I'm saying. Like Bruce Straley may think that we need to hear less, listen to the players, and more developers are our future, but the gaming industry's biggest disasters weren't caused by listening to players too much. They were caused by executives and studios becoming convinced that they always knew better than the audience funding the entire business in the first place. Like, developers absolutely deserve stability and creative freedom, right? Ain't nobody denying that one. But players are the reason the industry exists in the first place. The goal isn't choosing between developers and consumers, in my opinion. The goal should be making games that talented developers want to create and players actually want to buy. The problem here is that these two things seem to be at odds with one another constantly, and what Bruce Straley explained as an ex-Sony developer kind of perfectly encapsulates exactly what's going on with Sony as a corporation when it comes to how they make games these days. They think they know what players want, but if that were the case, they wouldn't have spent $400 million on Concord, thought that that game was going to be their new Star Wars, and then betted the farm on it, but they did do that, didn't they? That one massive failure already proves that Sony doesn't know what their fans want. Why are they remastering Horizon? Why are they doing Lego Horizon Adventures? Why is a God of War game starring Kratos' wife instead of the God of War himself? Because these are all design decisions the developers wanted, but clearly they're not what the players wanted. And if you want to pull it closer to home on Bruce Straley, Last of Us Part 2 sold about half of Part 1. I wonder why, Bruce. I mean, you would know, you directed the first game. It's because people wanted to be Joel, obviously. Instead, he gets his head caved in and replaced by Ellie with her harlot girlfriend and Abby. This isn't rocket science. Sony's decisions are almost perfectly aligned with what Bruce is saying right now, and him thinking that games like The Last of Us, for example, were not made because of fan interest is also crazy to me. As Bruce said here to a user in that same comment section as it reads, "Agreed, players buy games, but in my experience, no one told me players wanted Uncharted 2 or The Last of Us. It was having a stable, creatively supportive environment that produces those games. Except they did, Bruce. Uncharted is a male version of Tomb Raider with heavy ties to another fan-favorite blockbuster franchise called Indiana Jones. You took two formulas that already worked proven, right? And then you smashed them together with some James Bond added in for good measure, and you made your game what it was. And Last of Us makes even less sense. When that game was being made, zombies were all the rage. There was the show on, what was it called again? Oh, right, The Walking Dead. That was pulling in tens of millions of viewers every single week when The Last of Us was being developed and when it shipped too, by the way. The Last of Us owes its existence and hype because the environment around it, which was people buying and watching zombie post-apocalyptic content at the time and responding it, made total sense as to why The Last of Us blew up the way that it did. Again, look, I'm not attacking Bruce Straley. I'm just saying we have to use logic here and not insulated bubble feelings, okay? These games, alongside everything else that did well for Sony, did what it did because it adhered to what players wanted to see, right? That cannot be denied. Not to mention, when Last of Us was trending, you had games like BioShock, Dead Space, Metro 2033, and more that all paved the way in their own ways for The Last of Us to hit the way that it did. It's not like this game's concept came out of nowhere. It's a zombie game or Outbreak, whatever, right? This is like saying, wow, I'm a genius. I opened up a hamburger joint while being in a city where nobody eats anything but hamburgers. And I'm suddenly surprised that it did well. Again, Sony has forgotten this, however. Every concept Sony has championed, from third-person over-the-shoulder camera gameplay, heavy cinematic, and realistic visuals, are all inherently things tied directly to a westernized way of thinking. No one is denying making games in this manner, from God of War, Last of Us, Horizon, Ghost of Tsushima, and more, did well for Sony, but the issue is what happened to everything else after that, which was that Sony's portfolio has absolutely become homogenized by design, and the variety that once defined Sony as a first-party brand, that is shrinking. Would be cool if they had these, unique third-party exclusive console games like they used to in order to shake up the homogenized lineup they have, but they kind of fumbled that because they lost their core identity chasing those very same things. In a lot of ways, what Sony did is very similar to Ubisoft and their downfall. Every Ubisoft game at some point felt the same largely, right? Third-person shooter action games where you can climb things and do stealth somewhat. What game did I just explain? Was that Assassin's Creed? Was it Watch Dogs? Maybe it was Ghost Recon. All right, you can't tell because they all kind of do similar things, don't they? That's Sony too. If I say, yeah, it's that one Sony game where you play as a girl in a third-person camera angle fighting things, you'd be like, you have any idea how little that narrows it down for us? Gee, it's almost like it's been done to death or something over at Sony. Wow, imagine that. This is why Sony's dominance isn't as powerful as it used to be, because every major publisher who isn't Nintendo is increasingly adopting multi-platform strategies these days. Exclusive arrangements are becoming far less, unless your name is Nintendo again. And instead, every company, not named Nintendo, is pushing their games everywhere because none of these platforms that aren't Nintendo Nintendo can justify their own existence on their own anymore, because PlayStation historically benefited from being seen as the premier destination for certain experiences. The place where Japanese developers wanted their games to be day one, the place where major partnerships naturally happen like they used to, the place where gaming culture felt most vibrant and relevant. But if Sony continues moving away from that identity, what they're doing obviously, what incentive remains? By turning PlayStation into just another platform as they've been doing, what makes them different or unique starts disappearing too. And when uniqueness leaves, your leverage goes with it. That's why the partnerships became harder to justify, exclusivity too. And brand loyalty for many is harder to maintain than before, right? Because players, like I've been saying, ultimately follow the content, and content follows opportunity. Sony, by not listening to what players want, like Bruce Straley said as well, is why they're in this problem to begin with. If you want your console to be homogenized, lose its partnerships, and have no brand identity, well then Sony is doing a bang-up job doing that, no problemo. But if Sony wants to be an industry leader again and not a follower like it has been the entire PS5 generation, who are we kidding? They're gonna have to take a hard good look in the mirror and realize it's not the developers that they should be listening to. Because you guys tried that already, and then you made Concord and you canceled like 17 live service games before they even came out. And then you let Bungie spend like $300 million making Marathon, which has no players now, but you canceled Destiny 2, which the players, yet again, told you, Sony, they want more of, but oh, no. We don't listen to the players. No. We don't do that here. We listen to the developers, okay? We're Sony. We know what the players want. That's why we canceled Destiny 2 and spent $400 million making Concord after all. You know, the game that got delisted in 2 weeks, yeah, Sony, keep listening to your developers. I'm sure it's going to work out great for you if you keep doing it like right now. In the end, okay, the results have been catastrophic, audiences are not interested, and the lesson here should have been obvious, but if all you do is live in insulated environments of toxic bubble positivity, just sucking the farts out of your colleagues 24/7, I guess what I've been saying here might come off as mean-spirited to you. Oh no, how could I? But to anybody who's normal and isn't a cultist, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you ask me, Sony has an identity crisis that is rejecting its Japanese influence in favor of listening to what their Californian offices want instead, and that cannot be denied. Because of course, it's always better to listen to a green-haired feminist with a septum piercing with armpit hair over the base Japanese guy who made you guys what you are in the first place. What could go wrong? Well, everything apparently. Sony doesn't need to reinvent themselves, I guess. Their greatest strength has always been authenticity and creativity and offering things that nobody else can. These brands don't fall overnight, but one decision at a time, right? Until eventually we're going to be looking back at PlayStation and realizing the thing that we love disappeared because they kept listening to the developers in those bubbles over the people who actually keep their lights on. I wonder if things will change course, or maybe we're all headed to oblivion. Either way, I'm going to be there laughing like the Joker as we ride headlong into the inferno.